welcome to Vicious Whispers with Mark Tullius and my special guest, Luis Vega. He's an artist friend of mine. He actually did the cover for Somber Stroll. I'd hold that up, but then I dropped the mic, so I'll put it up on the screen. Oh, there it goes. And then also we have a story about Twisted Reunion, one of the pieces of art in that book. The story for, but that's Somber Stroll right there. I forgot how that came about. I know I met your wife, and she mentioned that you were an artist. I think we were working in the kids' library or something.
That's right.
Yeah, and then I found out you were an artist, and I thought it'd be cool if you drew something. Was that before or after you were so cool enough to get me to go to your school and do the talk with the Try Not to Die?
That's a good question.
I'm not sure.
I don't remember which one came first, but I do remember we also spoke at the library, and we talked about what we did and perhaps collaborated sometime.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
I'm glad it worked out.
Yeah, no, definitely. It was pretty cool. And I see you every once in a while around here. My wife is always wearing your shirt. She was wearing it today when I was like, hey, he's coming over tonight. And she just started laughing. Very comfortable shirt. I'll put up a picture of that too. So tell us a little bit about what you do, who you are, all that good stuff.
So my name is Luis Vega. I am an artist, an educator. I've been teaching for 15 years at a school in Lynwood High, so Go Knights. And I've been working also as an artist, visual artist, working in mixed media and collage.
So now, when did you know that you wanted to be an artist? Like, did you know, was that something like early on?
You know, as a kid, I have to give credit to my older brother. He, in the early 80s, he did graffiti art, and he kept a sketchbook. And as a kid, I would open that book, and it was like magic. I would see these really cool images, and I would try to replicate them.
Okay.
So that's when it started. And as I grew up, I would have teachers that would see that my interest and would give me a lot of support. So I thought that was really cool. You know, as an adult looking back, really them, knowing that I had a skill and an interest, and they would, put extra support. So as a kid, I wasn't a GATE student. I wasn't like one of those kids that, how would you say with the GATE students? How would you describe them? Like, I don't know. Maybe the intellect was a little bit more.
Yeah, that's kind of how it was with me. I don't think I was in those classes.
But it was funny because in elementary school, for those kids, they would have after school art.
Mm-hmm.
So I was invited to take the art classes. So I would see all the smart kids there. I would say like smart kids there, and I would show up to take art because they were offering it to them. So, and I was like, wow, what are these guys doing here now? Why did they get to take art?
Now, have you always kind of viewed yourself not as smart when really, I mean, you're an artist. Like, I think a lot of artists probably have that. Like, they might be good at one part of art, but I don't know, they may not say that's as equal to the person that's really good at math or they're really good at science.
Well, I have to say that through the arts, it just really motivated me to learn about other things. So as I grew older, I realized that the arts can help me motivate me with my writing or with math, with history, especially a lot of history I learned through the arts. So I found that I was pretty good at it. I liked it. And through that, I was able to learn so many other things. So that was kind of my engine that drove me. And then, realizing the value of it and what it can do for you and make a living with it. So it definitely propelled me to somewhere I wasn't sure I could be, because it's been very, very helpful. Yeah.
Now, how about what was your art like from as far back as you can remember? Like, did it always have a theme? Were you always thinking about, like, what did it start out as, and what is it now?
I think it started off from the beginning. Like, I was into, I would buy comic books as a kid in order to redraw and learn how to draw, anatomy and I would buy, how to draw books and stuff like that, just to kind of get some basics down to draw superheroes. Um, and I guess as I grew older and I started to find things that I liked that motivated me to draw, and I started to definitely look at more art and visit galleries and museums and learn more about artists. I was motivated to create images like artists like Charles White or Carrie James Marshall, who draw about people and social justice images and people's struggle and dignity and respect of people that are everyday people that are heroes. And so instead of drawing comic book heroes, I just draw regular people heroes, and I think that's what drives me now as an adult and thinking about people's everyday struggle. I think that's what motivates me.
Yeah, awesome. Now, what do you try to get across to students?
For students, like I mentioned, I found that the arts for me, again, really, I make my living as a teaching art and making art, and I find myself lucky to be able to do that and to work with people like you who are the same, who do it in another different genre. So I feel good that I can work with musicians or authors, or just for my personal work or other creative people, and it makes doing some really challenging projects but very fun projects that I really enjoy doing every day. And for my students, I try to also provide that option for them, letting them know that what they are doing is valuable, the skills they're learning is valuable. If they're there just for the year to get through those credits that they need, then that's great, and I hope they can gain an appreciation for creativity, and for those who want to pursue it into something more seriously, that it's an option for them, and I want to give those opportunities for them.
Awesome. Are there any, we talked a little bit about this off air, but what limitations are there for kids in school as far as what they can create artistically? And like, should those limits be there? Do you like that? I mean, is it restricting people?
I teach different levels in art, and we offer various courses at my school, and I teach beginning, advanced, and AP Studio, and pretty much there's so many issues that students can talk about, and we're all open for it. If they want to talk about getting divorced or violence in their communities, or racism, or any issue that they want to speak about. And I guess unless they're drawing something because they want to threaten somebody's life, or they want to hurt themselves or stuff like that. Mm-hmm. I mean, I get to know the students pretty well with what I teach, and if it's a concern of somebody's health, then I gotta take a step back and try to talk to someone about it to make sure that people are safe.
Yeah.
And I think that's okay. I mean, if it's a concern for somebody's health, then yeah, I think it's okay to be aware of those things and take some kind of action to make sure that everything is okay. But if the students is just doing that because they want to reflect on something, sometimes I see kids do something on violence because that's what they see in their community, mm-hmm. and that's okay with me
right.
for them to say this is why I'm doing it. So there definitely has to be some communication about the purpose of why people do things.
No, and that actually makes a lot of sense, because before I was like, well, man, stuff I did in high school would have got me called into the office for sure, and they would have been concerned about me. But I was like, you know what, that probably would have been good for me, because I was a mess, and so and it probably is what I needed. But I got away with it, and now look what happened. All right, tell me a little bit about what is it considered? The new program that you're part of.
The new program, it's for the College Board, and it's a pre-AP program, and the program is geared for freshmen, and it's what I like about it. It's geared towards more about the process of art making. So, in the past, I've done some experimentation. Students get to experiment with materials, and they make artworks, and we do some reflection. But with this new curriculum, it has to deal more about documenting the experimentation and the process. So it's geared more towards focusing on the process of art making and letting students know that the process is just as important as the final product. And that goes from beginning students to advanced students to, you know, professional artists that I think that, you know, document and do more writing, which I think is great, to think about the purpose, about why they're doing things and not just making something just to make it, but stating, giving, and what I like about it too is that it's not about, you know, having perfect grammar or anything like that structural. It's just like writing it down. You know, I get to fly around the country, train other people, but it's something that my school piloted, and I'm currently working on in my classroom as well. And you know, it's something that I think that's important, and I've enjoyed seeing what the students can do when talking about the process. And like I mentioned, everyone that I teach is in a different place as far as producing art. So for those beginners, it's great for them to see that just kind of playing with ideas is awesome, and being able to write more and explain. And I feel like the lessons have been very enriched with more of the writing and having those discussions. And it's not me just like, sometimes kids will say, well, what do I paint, what do I draw, what tell me what I could add here. And this time I'm just kind of like being able to re-ask them the question when it's the process. I'm like, well, what's your intent, what's the content, put it in context for me, asking those kinds of questions. And then they can reflect back and say, okay, well, this is what I was trying to do. Okay, well, if you're trying to do that, then what can you do? And then they go back and kind of rework those ideas. So I really appreciate those things. And in addition to that, you know, there's always been, you know, and we know that it's a curriculum that supplements what I already do. So it's not like this is a new thing that I'm doing across the board. It's like I'm taking what I do and embed it with the curriculum. There's a diverse group of artists that we talk about and that I include with my art, so students get to see different cultures and different styles of art. You know, what I like to do is, like, by the end of the school year, I can put a chair in the front of the class and say, why is this art? And, you know, they can explain it to me, because, you know, there's so many types of art that you see in so many genres that sometimes with contemporary art it's kind of hard to understand. And that's what I also want them to understand, is that you don't have to be a good drawer to art. You don't have to be a good drawer to make art, or you don't have to be a painter, because sometimes, you know, people have the misconception that this is art is if you can paint a realistic picture, so people shy away from it.
Right.
But you can make a statement by using something that already exists, or making a mark with anything that can make a mark, and that's art, and that's a valuable thing.
That's
because
cool.
If you have something you want to say, you can do it with all different ways.
Have you seen like emotional breakthroughs with students, like through the creation of their art?
I think yes. I've been teaching for 15 years, and I've seen students experience different things with the art, and I think we've done so many different kinds of projects, like in and out of class. That's another thing that I'm very interested in, is having the students work in the community or on their campus. So sometimes they make art that's, you know, whether they're going out to help kids make, you know, my high school students going out to a museum helping kids, or they're painting a mural, or they're doing projects and surprising themselves when they realize that they can do it. You know, a lot of times kids come in and say, well, I'm not an artist, and from time to time they'll be making things hit or miss, and there's times where they really hit something that they didn't have any idea that they could have done before, and they surprise themselves. And I think those are really great moments. Or if they're painting a mural and really excited at saying, hey, I did this, and it's in the community and people think it's important, and it makes them feel good.
Very cool, man.
Yeah.
When you have a new class, like let's say after a couple weeks, can you tell who's going to be like just maybe the best? Like, because you could do that in other classes, you kind of know. But are some people just like they're just maybe born artists, or they just have it in them? And
well, I do some beginning of the school year. I definitely do some warm up exercises, because, you know, kids are moving in and out of the classroom the first couple weeks. So with some of those warm up exercises, I get to see pretty early, like, you know, and I'll ask the kids, and I'll say, hey man, do do you draw at home? And they'll say, yeah, I do. Or,
Mhm.
oh, when I'm bored, I do. Or some kids say, no, this I've never drawn.
Yeah.
And then I'm like, okay. And it just, some kids can be very comfortable. And whenever I give them like one of those warm-ups at the first couple weeks, that you can see them right away. They might be using a tool differently than other kids. And that's why I'm saying, okay, this kid has had some experience, so they're very comfortable. They're not, some kids will need my help and assistance, like, pretty, all the way through the process. So, yeah, I can tell for sometimes. And then other times, you see a lot of growth, too.
That's cool.
Yeah.
You were showing me something in your notebook, something you recently created, and talking about this made me think, like, I would be interested in, like, how that was created. Because I think a lot of people will see something like, oh, well, I can't do that, or I can't make a complete thing, whether it's a short story or painting or whatever it is, because you just can't see it. I don't know. They think they don't know the steps.
Well, just kind of going back before I show that, we talked about a little bit before we started to film as well, and I think there's a lot of different ways that people, the artists create, and they create their own systems and constraints, and it works differently. Some people will, I don't know how you do it, but I know some people put the time in. I was just talking to some filmmaker friends, and they say that whether they have ideas or not, they'll sit down in the morning and they'll do whatever they can do at that time, whether they're feeling it or not. They'll make that time. For me, it's like I teach, and my teaching takes a lot of my time, so it's really important to keep a sketchbook. That's for me, and for a writer, I'm sure you can say writing notes down. It's because I have ideas in here in my other sketchbooks that I have that I'll keep. I'll come back to them and refinish the points that I started with a couple years ago, or I don't fully develop them, and opportunities come, and I can pull an idea from here that's 5 years old and it's still new because it's not fully developed yet. So yeah, I pull different things. Sometimes I start something and it's not fully finished, and I'll let it marinate for a little bit, then I'll come back to finish it off, like we were mentioning, in parts. There's so many of these art competition shows which they require people to design something. I don't know if you're familiar with some of those, but they'll give you 24 hours to create a painting or clothing design or something. And I think I would suck at those because of the way that I do, and I'm sure it would be good, there's to just try it out, just to test yourself. Like if someone were to say, hey, you have 24 hours to write a book, a short story, and there's a competition of 10 writers. I mean, it'd be a good challenge just to try it, but
yeah, it
wouldn't. Once.
Yeah, it wouldn't fit in my process. But it'd be interesting to see what would happen.
Yeah, just kind of giving different challenges, but I noticed, like, as a teacher, like I do a lot of demos. I do I cover lots of topics and themes and skills. So what I started to think about is just like trying to keep those, because I some of those ideas I work on. Sometimes I'll draw something and I draw it on paper, so I realize like I should be keeping these and storing them. And the way I work anyways is ripping and tearing papers and collaging and printmaking. So what I start to do is saving them and using them for my own works.
Oh, that's smart.
That way I have, resources that I create that I can use. Sometimes I give them away, because sometimes students will like my demos and they'll say, hey, can I have that?
That's cool.
So I try to, give them opportunities, and if they like it and then excites them, then hopefully it'll motivate them in the classroom. So this one's kind of a personal one here. I'll show it to you guys. And this one is I think during this time I was doing a perspective assignment in my classroom. So perspective is definitely an essential, like linear perspective.
Mm-hmm.
So drawing buildings or interiors and using 1 or 2 points. So I created this image of a room, and it was also talking about just being able to listen. So that's why at the very bottom of it there's a large ear. And so I think the first thing I did was just kind of start with drawing the image of the room, some doors, And as I was kind of going through the rest of it, I was just thinking about my own personal relationship with my wife and thinking about things I could do better. And I started to kind of add different things in here that kind of relate to me. So I think a lot of the themes, like I mentioned, are about personal struggle or social justice, everyday people that trying to get through obstacles in their life and do better. And I think this is one of the things that I use, one of the techniques that I've been teaching my class to kind of help reflect on some of the things that I want to do. So, and that's how this one kind of started here.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
I was going to share with you, if you don't mind hearing it,
Sure.
the process, because for me it was pretty interesting, of how this last, the latest short story just developed. Because I'll often tell my daughter about this kind of stuff too, because she wants to write, but she always feels like, oh, how do you write a story? And all my friends that I want to co-author with, they're like, well, how do we write a story? And they'll sit down and they expect like just to write a full book or a full story. I'm like, no, man, it's like it takes work and it takes time. It takes going over and over and over and just like, so generally I'll like write something down, like I might only know that much. But that's what happened. I think it was on Saturday. We had some friends over. Someone said something, and I heard it, and then I was like, hold on a second. I ran inside to get my pen before I forgot my idea. So that probably took about 10 seconds for me to write it down. I went back out and I talked, and in my head though I'm developing this idea and I'm seeing more and more. And then so it develops into maybe a page worth of notes. And I'll show pictures of this, I'll take pictures. Turns into a page of notes, and then I went and I took it to, I decided to try drawing it out. Because I always like to putting anything on paper helps so much. But just being able to have the pictures made me realize so much more, and I started doing more and more notes. Went back to my notes. Now it's like 2.5 pages. I can see everything that's happening. There's still a couple things that I don't know, but it's like every pass you just go a little bit more, and I'll write down like, I don't know if this happens, or I don't know what she's wearing, but I know this, and I know this, and I know this, and I know this, and I don't know. It's been fun. It's been fast. Like this is probably one of the fastest I've ever developed a story. Like and I'm only doing it like the first time. There's just maybe 30 minutes worth of work. I popped in today after doing nonfiction. I was tired of nonfiction, so I jumped on it and maybe did another like half hour of work and drew everything. And so yeah, I think it was just interesting because that's not necessarily my normal thing, but I was just very conscious of it because of knowing I was going to be talking to you. I was like, okay. So yeah, there's probably going to be. Oh, and other thing, super big catharsis because it's about traumatic brain injuries. So all my time right now I'm spending looking into brain damage, trying to see how much brain damage I have, if any, but it's probably a good amount. And then my friends, and so it's like that's all that's on my mind. I'm doing research. I'm part of like a fighter study. I'm getting tested. I'm trying different therapies. And so in this short story, it's about someone that has similar issues that is able to go to this therapy that fixes them with a heavy price. It's a horror story.
Wow.
It's pretty gross. But and I told my daughter, I was talking to her about it, I was like, this is my therapy. I was like, I'm working out my fears right here with this character.
Yeah.
It was like, it's not, and I think I do that a lot with my fiction. I think a lot of authors might say, you're either writing nonfiction or you write fiction, but lots of my fiction is like so fucking close to being nonfiction. Like I might just change a couple facts, and I'm cool.
Yeah.
I was like, yeah, the story's about me, but here's what happened. So I don't know, just something.
And so yeah, thanks. I'm glad to hear that. And I think part of it kind of thinks of the way like you're saying, running back. As soon as you hear something, you want to jot it down and not forget it. So those are important things. Is to not let go of those ideas from the beginning and jot them down and give them time to breathe a little bit and go back and build on them. So like you're saying, like you're researching, you're part of a group. Like what do you mean when you say that you're part of a research group?
So I was part of a fighter studies, which is just I'm a participant in it. So every year, it's supposed to be every year, but I do it like every year and a half. You have to go and get tested, like an MRI and a battery of tests, and then that's pretty much it. And like blood draw. And so they're looking for the first signs of CTE, brain damage. But for my book, I'm just researching different things. Like I interviewed that doctor and about CTE, and then this other doctor that I'm part of his program, I'll be interviewing him, and then different specialists and with different therapies, and like an expert on sleep, and all the things that can help people that do have traumatic brain injuries.
Wow.
So yeah, that's not fun.
Yeah, I mean, it's like you said, it's things that I think are important for, especially if you've gone through some of those things and you're talking about it, and there's a lot of people that go through that, and so.
Yeah, for sure. And the more I'm seeing it and the more I'm looking at it, it's kids that there's a lot of people that don't even know that they had like a traumatic brain injury. Like they might have just been hit in the head with a soccer ball, and it might have been 30 years ago, and now they're having these symptoms. So yeah, it is interesting though.
And I think that's one of the things that's important too, is that when we're creating things or books or art, there's so many things that happen to people, and sometimes they feel like it's just them, like they don't know anybody else that went through a similar thing.
Mm-hmm.
So when they get out there to kind of look a little bit more, see a little bit more what people are talking about, what people are making, and they realize like, wow, this person went through what I did, and I didn't know that. So they just see it through a book, or through an artwork, and they make connections, and it helps them that way. And I think I also appreciate that too, and from to show my students, I think they have a lot of access to films and music. Those are two things that I think that people consume a lot.
Right.
I don't know about how you feel about like reading or like arts. Like I have to really feel like I gotta get them out there to expose them more to those kinds of things.
Yeah, I think that's huge, and that's one of the main reasons, and probably the only reason I'm actually writing this book, because I don't want to write it, but I think other people that read, like, not only is it guys that might have traumatic brain injuries, but it's also guys that might be really depressed only, or it might be guys that are suicidal, or it might be guys that are this or that or whatever. And then I think it is helpful to see like, okay, yeah, this guy did it. He's here. He still struggles or whatever. But yeah, and that's why I try to be as vulnerable as possible, whether it's on the podcast or in my writing. But like this book is definitely is not a tell-all, but I'm talking like it starts off by saying like I should never own a gun again, and I really go into how reckless I was and just. But I think that is important, because I think a lot of people have those kinds of thoughts, but they feel like they're never going to tell anyone else.
Sure. Yeah, and I think sometimes those people, they don't tell anyone else. They don't talk to anyone else. They think it's just them. Like what's going on with me? But I think and through the arts, people tell their stories in a creative way and in an interesting way that people see it and they're like, wow, this is not something I expected, or that someone else is going through this and this is how they're showing it in this way. So I think it could be powerful in that way, and I've appreciated that. I think one thing we were also talking about, like when I first started teaching, I was trying to be this guy that came in as like a role model and dress accordingly and just say, hey, this is I just wanted to be as professional as I can and just trying to be that person for the students. But and as I've been there now for this amount of time, 15 years, I definitely try to be a lot more honest and like you said, vulnerable, and I still definitely professional and be that person that I hope students can relate to and learn something from. But I also start off the school year now like showing my GPA as from elementary through high school through college, and showing the struggles I had with my grades and just saying, hey, like what do these represent? I don't even tell them what they are. They see the low numbers and they're like, well, that looks like GPA, and I say, okay, well how did it get from here to here? Like I mentioned, I did pretty well in college but in high school I sucked as a kid. but it was just like I didn't know what I wanted, or I didn't college seemed so far, something for the smart kids, and I didn't know that that's something that could be so attainable, and so I think now I just try to give my experiences, provide some ideas about what they can do and how they can do it, and I work in a community where I can definitely relate to with a lot of the kids and what they're going through. So, yeah, I think when some of the things that you write, I feel like you kind of do the same thing.
Yeah,
Just
no,
write
for sure.
things that people can relate to.
I was just thinking we should, so I forget what year it was, probably 2 years ago or 3 years ago, we ran a contest with your class.
Yeah.
Was it just one class? How many kids were eligible? I don't know.
I think it was my advanced class. It's a class. I think it was actually 2 classes. I might have done it with my AP class as well.
Okay.
I think it was maybe about 40, 50 students. So again, thanks again. That was such a great experience for them and an opportunity for them, and appreciate you.
That was super cool to even let me do it. So what we did, we ran a little contest, and it was to produce a drawing for one of the short stories. Was it just, did I give you a list of short stories, or I don't
you gave me that
this story. Okay.
And what I did was, like, we read it together. The kids read it individually. We spent like 4 or 5 weeks because they read it. We kind of broke it down in pieces. Each group of students read a section. They designed as a group, and then they were able to look at what they completed and then design as individuals. And then they all kind of looked at what worked best.
That's awesome. No, so it was a cool process, and I love the art. So I'll do a close-up of that. But that is by, can you tell us a little bit about who did it and if it meant anything to you?
So first off, like your story, the drama and the thriller, it's perfect age for high school students. They really enjoyed reading it and kind of seeing how it all the story unfolded. And then once we got to illustrating, they all picked different parts of the story to think about. And this student, Jennifer Sid, she had done very well. That's the whole school year. She's one of the kinds of students that you give her any kind of assignment and she does really does it with a lot of love. And she made the scene of the front of the house, and I can't recall exactly the book and part of the story, but I know it was about the house, and it was described as the plants were dead, and it's kind of run down, I think. And then she used her perspective skills that she was trained to do, and she did a beautiful ink drawing. Jennifer Sid was a senior that year, and since then she's in college, and she's pursuing an art degree. And she was acknowledged by the school and given some recognition for publishing, with your
awesome.
help and your opportunity that you gave her. And I think it was a big motivation, and like I mentioned, being able to work with artists like you to provide opportunities for high school students really is a confidence boost. And I think this really helped her when I was talking about earlier about showing the kids the value of what they do. This was a big one. She stepped away pursuing art. I've talked to her recently, and she's doing very well in school. And she's one person that can say that she's published by the book, but she's published in a book which not a lot of people can say. So
that's cool.
Really great. Yeah.
No, well, thank you very much, Jennifer, and thank you for running that. So that was awesome.
Sure.
So let's do another one. I'll have to figure out. I have a new collection coming out called Untold Mayhem. I don't know if I told you guys, but it's probably still like 3 months out. So it would be good timing. We'll do one of the short stories for that. I already have someone working on the cover design. Actually, the guy who did Messiah is working on the cover.
That's a cool cover.
Dude. And that's another friend. That's someone that just lives here in Whittier.
Okay.
He's an awesome illustrator. He's actually going to do the audiobook for it too, because he has a great voice.
Okay.
So
and also perspective. I guess he's like 3-point perspective there.
Yeah. So being able to do collaboration is awesome, and being able to do it with kids, I was like, that's cool. I was a little bit worried that the Twisted Reunion was a little bit too adult. Actually, it was just on a panel at a horror convention about young adult horror fiction and what it should be and what it should not be. Because I thought my stuff's a little bit too dark.
Yeah.
But that story I think was okay. And so I'll find another one that's okay, so that way you don't get in trouble for exposing the kids to my stuff.
No, that's okay.
All right. There's 27 stories, so I could find like 1 or 2 good ones to pick from. I think that's what I did last time. Maybe I think you might have picked between a couple stories.
I think you're right. Yeah, I think I did go through them.
So yeah, that's a good screening process.
Yeah, and I think it's fun, like when you're collaborating with people and you know, you're really excited about the project and they believe in what you're doing in each other, and I think that's great. Yeah, if you have like I appreciate working with you. You're working with your friend here. Yeah, I can see your vision.
That's cool.
It really translates with images. Yeah.
Awesome. All right. So we will figure out what that image is going to be. We'll start that content. When could you just start it? Could you start it at like any time, or are they busy with other projects?
You know,
school hasn't even started yet.
School hasn't even started. They start next week. But the nice thing about my art class, the level 2, because I usually work with them because they're pretty flexible. They're pretty flexible in what I can do, and I would say, as the school year starts, giving them a little time to kind of get back into the mode, the work mode, and giving them some review, and sometime mid-year would be good. Mid-year would be good to kind of they're in the thick of it, and they've done some practice, and they're feeling a little bit confident.
Okay.
That way they can jump in and say, yeah, let's do this.
All right. Done. So now we got that contest going.
All right.
So someone from Lynwood High. Awesome. It's cool how that works out. Let's go out on, I gotta get some sleep, I'm exhausted. Let's go out on the story that Jennifer illustrated. So Book of Revelation, I don't think I played that one on here for a while, so that's what we have today. It's narrated by T. Quillen. Thank you so much, Luis, for stopping by.
Man. Appreciate
awesome
it.
working with you.
Being out here with you.
Yeah, no, very cool. And we'll definitely have you back on. And
anytime.
All right, man. Thank you very much.
Right.
I'll talk to you later.
Right.
Book of Revelation. Professor John Warrington stood in the middle of the driveway, an 8-foot-high gate towering before him. To his right was an intercom console. Its red button had faded considerably since he'd last been to this house more than 5 years ago. That was a day he would never forget, no matter how hard he tried. Not yet ready to announce himself, not sure if he'd ever be, and thinking that maybe it would be best if he'd just turn around and go home, John tried to peer through the wrought iron gate to glimpse what awaited him. But the once immaculate gate was now an impenetrable wall of ivy and brambles. The only metal showing was the sharp, rusted points that begged for blood, taunting the foolish to climb over them, hoping they'd slip and impale themselves on the menacing spikes. John wondered again what he was doing here, why he had agreed to the old man's invitation. They hadn't spoken since that day 5 years ago when Hazelwood, John's former professor, mentor, and friend, had let John know exactly what he thought of him. Not only had Hazelwood kicked John out of his house and his life, but he'd threatened John with far worse. The old man had been 70 years old then, and appeared physically incapable of carrying out the vengeance he'd threatened. But his words still echoed in John's mind. People change, John told himself. They get older. They calmed down. They realized they had jumped to conclusions and overreacted. Hazelwood had probably decided to forgive John and didn't want to take his grudge to the grave. At least that's what John tried to believe. The old man's threats replayed in his mind as John glanced over his shoulder to the car he'd left at the bottom of the winding driveway. He should be at home, sitting next to the phone. Even though he had his cell phone with him and the police had promised they would alert him immediately if there were any new developments, it didn't feel right to be away from home while Susan was missing. She'd been gone since January. John had come home one afternoon to find their front door wide open. There was one suitcase missing and some of her clothes, but John had never believed she'd packed it herself. There hadn't been a note, and Susan would never have walked out without saying goodbye. She was many things, but she was not someone who just ran. John rarely left his house since she'd vanished. He'd done nothing but pace the halls of their home, barely eating, sleeping less than a few hours at a time. The police, along with his friends and family, had encouraged John to go on living his life as best he could. They said sitting at home wouldn't bring Susan home any faster, and the last 2 months had proved their case. He knew that everyone believed Susan had left him. She was half John's age, gorgeous, and intelligent. But Susan loved him. Of that much John was certain. They were going to be married in the fall. Hazelwood's invitation was the first John had considered since Susan disappeared. His old mentor had sounded so excited on the phone that John had agreed immediately, despite his better judgment. Truthfully, John needed the distraction. There was still the nagging feeling that this wasn't a good idea. But John was out of the house now, and if he didn't go through with the visit, he would never find out what Hazelwood had to tell him. Maybe the old man wanted to apologize after all these years. Or maybe he expected one from John. Perhaps Hazelwood needed John's advice on a book. The old man would be reluctant to turn to John for assistance, especially after the so-called betrayal, but Hazelwood was getting on in years and might be desperate enough to ask for John's help. Word on campus was that Hazelwood had been living as a recluse for the past few years, rarely venturing from his property. Rumor was that he'd finally given up his search for the mysterious books he'd once dedicated his entire life to finding. John shivered against a sudden chill. Not only was he nervous about the impending reunion, but in his haste to leave the house, he hadn't thought to grab a jacket. Twilight had turned to dusk, and he found his lightweight polo shirt lacking. John pressed the button on the intercom. Almost instantly, Professor Hazelwood's voice sounded from the metal box.
"Is that you, Jonathan?"
John greeted his old mentor, surprised by the pleasantness in Hazelwood's voice. He was unable to detect any of the anger that he'd heard on their last visit.
"Then come on in, old chap,"
the professor said as the gate began to hum and slowly creak open. John took a step forward, then stopped suddenly, stunned by the full view of the professor's lawn and gardens, which had once been meticulously manicured. Now everything was overgrown or dead. Images of southern graveyards came to mind, but even those places had some order to the flora. This looked as if nature had been given free rein to do whatever it liked. Still teetering on the edge of turning around and leaving, John thought of the Beretta 9mm hidden on the top shelf of his closet at home. He'd considered bringing it after he accepted the invitation to visit the man he'd nearly destroyed. But ultimately he told himself he was being paranoid, and he left it locked in the security box. Now, whether or not the old man had been serious, John couldn't ignore the fact that Hazelwood had threatened his life the last time the two had met. The intercom buzzed, and Hazelwood's voice came across.
"The tea is getting cold, Jonathan."
John scanned the grounds for the camera that was allowing the professor to monitor him. He found it hidden halfway up the pine tree to the left of the intercom. Hazelwood had been watching him the whole time. Not willing to look any more ridiculous than he already did, John started up the driveway, the gate closing slowly behind him. There was still beauty in the garden. It just had to be found. A solitary rose blooming amid the thorny brush on the left side of the driveway, a young sapling emerging from the wall of weeds to the right. Good can survive with the bad, and life goes on, John thought. But then he looked to the rotting tomato plants and realized everything comes to an end. The door to the professor's house was just ahead. Now was the time to deal with Hazelwood and see what all this was about. Susan would be fine. The black maple door opened just as John raised his hand to knock. Hazelwood appeared, dressed in a shabby dinner jacket. The yellow crest on the pocket was fraying. So was Hazelwood. Thin wisps of silver hair stuck out in every direction. He was a tiny shell of the man John had studied under nearly 2 decades ago. His back hunched, making him look like a turtle, especially the way his small head, with its beady eyes, poked forward from the collar of his shirt. Hazelwood pushed his glasses up his nose and smiled. "You can put your hand down, Jonathan, unless you mean to strike me." The old man's sly smile and questionable sense of humor worried John. He had betrayed Hazelwood's loyalty when he published The Book of Revelation, Exposing the Truth, He'd gained the man's trust, learned all he could about the sacred and secret tomes, and then wrote a book systematically disproving their existence. In doing so, Hazelwood's life's work was ruined. He'd still had his tenure at the university, but he'd lost all credibility. John hadn't set out to deliberately hurt the old man. He simply saw the fallacy in what Hazelwood espoused. At the time he was researching and writing it, John had told himself that Hazelwood would be dead before his book hit the market. But he'd obviously been mistaken, and the book's publication had crushed Hazelwood. Now the old man was smiling up at John as if nothing bad had happened between them. John lowered his hand and scratched at the scraggly, unkempt beard he'd been meaning to shave for several weeks. "Good to see you, Professor. You look well."
"Thank you, Jonathan. I would say the same, but then you'd know I was lying."
Before John could respond, Hazelwood continued.
"But that is to be expected. I read about Susan's disappearance. Are there any new developments?"
John could only shake his head.
"Oh, that's a shame. I did enjoy her company."
Hazelwood moved out of the doorway and waved John inside.
"I don't want to waste any more of your time than I need to. I heard you're writing another book, and I wouldn't want to impede your progress."
John winced at the dig, then entered the house, and waited while Hazelwood closed the door behind them. John admitted, "I haven't written a single word since she disappeared."
"I'm sorry to hear that."
Hazelwood shuffled down the hallway and motioned for John to follow. He led him into the bookcase-lined study where they used to meet every week to pore over manuscripts and letters from antiquity. Hazelwood pointed John to the seat at the head of a long oak table. John walked behind the chair and studied Hazelwood's emotionless face. "What's this about, if you don't mind my asking?"
"Actually, I do. It's a surprise. Now have a seat while I fetch the tea."
John wanted to protest. The idea of a surprise made him feel ill. But there was no sense in pushing Hazelwood. The old man would talk when he was ready. He'd learned that lesson 1,000 times over the years. Might as well take a seat and relax. A few minutes later, Hazelwood re-entered the study pushing a small bronze cart. After pouring the tea and maneuvering the cart into a corner of the room, Hazelwood said,
"I let go of the help, in case you were wondering."
Instead of saying that he had gathered that much from the garden, John simply nodded and took a sip of the Dahang Bao tea, a treat which he hadn't had in 5 years. It tasted just as delicious and exotic as he remembered. Hazelwood shuffled to the other side of the table and took a seat opposite John. Looking over the top of his steaming mug, he studied John's face. John waited for as long as he could. "What is it, Arthur?" he asked impatiently, foregoing his usual formalities. I don't have time." Hazelwood held up his hand to quiet John, finished sipping his tea, then set down the mug.
"You'll want to see this."
"I don't see anything," John said, irritated as he looked about the room. John knew he was being rude, but all he wanted to do was leave. Just seeing his mentor's face brought back the feelings of guilt.
"Maybe you can't see what you don't believe."
John pushed away from the table. "I'm sorry, maybe I shouldn't have come."
"John, sit,"
Hazelwood said with the same force he used on his more unruly students.
"You don't want to help me?"
I'm sorry. Tell me what you want."
"I want the expert of rare books to verify my greatest find, the one you and I have been discussing since the day we first met."
John perked up, recalling his first visit to Hazelwood's office. John had been a sophomore and was desperately trying to get into Hazelwood's class, Lost Books of the Ancient World. He tried to remember the list Hazelwood had compiled and hung on his office wall. Which one? You haven't found the unedited Taming of the Shrew. Shakespeare had always been Hazelwood's favorite, even though he'd spent the better part of a decade trying to disprove the bard's authorship on classics such as Macbeth. Hazelwood shook his head and got up from the table to take down the painting that hung between the two largest bookcases. A safe. He dialed in the combination.
Even better.
John couldn't begin to think what could be better. Shakespeare's comedies, histories, and tragedies had sold for over $6 million, a dozen times more than John's most lucrative find. If it was much better than that, it explained Hazelwood's friendly disposition and forgiving attitude. Don't tell me it's a Da Vinci. John guessed as Hazelwood opened the safe's door.
You won't guess.
Hazelwood slipped on a pair of latex gloves he kept in the safe. John leaned forward in his chair but couldn't identify the cover of the thick book Hazelwood extricated from the safe. Its glossy black binding with red letters looked to be something from the latter half of the 20th century. Whatever it was, it couldn't be more than 60 years old, and as far as he knew, nothing of much value had been produced that recently. When he looked at Hazelwood's crooked smile, he wondered if perhaps the old man had lost it. Holding the book so John couldn't see the title, Hazelwood handed him a pair of gloves. Once he had them on, Hazelwood set the book on the placemat before John. Stephen King's The Stand. Complete and uncut. Not even a first edition. And probably only worth the $27 any store would charge for it. If this is a joke, I don't much appreciate it, John said. You said this was something I had to see.
How many times have you been told not to judge a book by its cover? Surely you, of all people, should know that.
John breathed through his nose, reached into his shirt pocket and pulled out his reading glasses. As he slipped them on, he examined the cover, searched for anomalies and imperfections that could raise the value, but he couldn't detect a single one. What exactly am I looking for, Arthur? Hazelwood returned to his seat and took another sip of tea.
Open it. Tell me what you see.
Exaggerating in order to humor Hazelwood, John lifted the cover with the utmost care. The smell of rotten meat wafted from the title page, and immediately brought tears to his eyes. John turned his head to the side and slammed the book shut. What the hell was that? John wiped the spit from his mouth, realized he could no longer smell the foul stench. All he smelled was the tea. Hazelwood offered his infuriating smile.
You tell me,
he said, ever the teacher. It smelled like death inside a toilet.
That's aptly put, Hazelwood said, almost to himself.
So what is it? Instead of answering John, Hazelwood instructed him to open the book again. John steadied his stomach and prepared for the gut-wrenching smell as he opened the cover. But this time there was nothing except the aroma of aged paper. But it... John trailed off helplessly, looking up at Hazelwood for an explanation.
Read the details inside the cover. See anything interesting?
John wasn't familiar with many of King's works, but he had read this book after the miniseries had come out. Everything, as far as he could tell, seemed to be in order as he scanned the page. Then he came to the copyright date. 19666. His first thought was that someone had accidentally hit the 6 key one too many times. But then he considered the newer-looking cover. How old is King?
60 or so.
He wrote this as a teenager?
Not quite. The official copyright was 1978.
Interesting, John said, not all that impressed by one mistype. How many of these were printed with this date?
You're looking at it.
Just the one? Hazelwood motioned to the book.
Keep going.
Annoyed, but more than intrigued, John turned the page and read the dedication aloud. To all my true believers, may your fate be revealed. John looked to Hazelwood and asked, Do you have another copy of this book? As if reading John's mind, Hazelwood recited, For Tabby, this dark chest of wonders. That's the original dedication. The one I'm sure you'd read as a younger man. John didn't want to jump to an irrational and impossible conclusion. He'd needed more proof before he could even acknowledge the question the dedication sparked. He'd heard this dedication countless times, but it had been years since Hazelwood discussed it. To all my true believers, may your fate be revealed. Anything else? John asked, knowing he needed more than a dedication to even begin to entertain what Hazelwood was suggesting. Hazelwood nodded. If you need more convincing, that is no problem. Be assured, you have the book in front of you. With one hand ready to turn the page, John said, Professor, you and I both know it doesn't exist. This might meet some of the so-called criteria, but this is not. All I ask is that you hold your judgment until you've finished the examination. This is what you want me to believe, isn't it? That this is the book of Revelation? John wasn't referring to the one from the Bible, but the original written a century before the New Testament. Legend said it had been burned over 1 million times, but it couldn't be destroyed. Instead, it found its way into other books, hiding in the pages of lesser works. That's not what I want you to believe, Hazelwood said. It's what I want you to acknowledge. It's what I want you to verify. I can't verify a myth. Yes, you can, and you will. You will verify that this is real, that this is here, and that both you and your book were mistaken. John started to close the cover, but Hazelwood told him to stop. What are you afraid of, John? If it's just a hoax, as you claim, then the book of Revelation doesn't exist. But there's no harm in checking, is there? It seems to me that you would want to do that. Look at it as me giving you another chance to disprove me, to embarrass me once again. I didn't write my book to embarrass you. But you did. Now verify my finding, or disprove it. Hazelwood insisted, staring at John. This wasn't a simple request, and both men knew it. Still, Hazelwood wasn't about to let John walk out the door. You owe me that. An unexplainable panic surged through John's body, urging him to run. It had been a mistake to come here, but he was here. The professor deserved his time. Even though John's book had been accurate, he still should have told his mentor what he was publishing. Hazelwood had discovered his pupil's writing the same way as everyone else, in the newspaper. John acquiesced, figuring he could do a quick examination of the book and be done with the whole mess. John looked at the book, then back at Hazelwood. After I prove this is not the book you've been spending your whole life in search of, you'll let me go and I'll owe you nothing? Let you go? Hazelwood laughed. You're not being held. I'm simply requesting a small favor from an old friend, the preeminent authority on fakes, forgeries, and fables. John's guilt reached nauseating proportions. Fine, let's do this. He turned past the author's note and browsed over the preface. What else is there? Another typo, an inscription? Turn to a page in Chapter 1. John did as he was told. So what am I looking for? What page are you on? There was a number 1 in the middle of the footer at the bottom of the left-hand page, but a 5 on the page beside it. John began speed reading the page, searching for any kind of abnormality. Everything appeared just as he'd read it in his dog-eared copy, when suddenly, across the page, 5 non-consecutive words transformed from black to bright red. The words then made their way toward the header. John mumbled his disbelief. "Yes?" Hazelwood said giddily. "What is this?" John asked. But before Hazelwood answered, John looked at the old man and said, "Okay, nice trick. Okay, well done. How did you manage that?" "I didn't do anything." "The ink turns color when the air hits it, or is it the temperature change?" Hazelwood smiled. "It's no trick. What does it say?" Reluctantly, John read the highlighted words to himself. Respect, don't, him, you. Always quick with puzzles, he rearranged the order of the words. You don't respect him. Instead of telling Hazelwood this, though, he shook his head and said, "I'm surprised you'd sink that low." "There's no deception. I have no idea what it reads." "Then I'm even sadder, because either you've been duped this easily or you think I'm an idiot." Hazelwood didn't seem bothered by John's disbelief. "Try another page." "Which one?" "Your choice." Figuring Hazelwood would direct him to specific doctored pages, John was surprised to be given a choice, but only slightly. "Don't tell me you fixed every page. This had to cost some money." "Not to mention the amount of time it would take to do what you're suggesting I did." Hazelwood made a good point. But it only made the situation more pathetic. Any page, right? "Anyone you choose. Be my guest." John flipped through a few dozen pages before stopping. Hazelwood asked him what number he'd landed on. John said, "It should read 47, but there's only a 2. A mistake, but not a very revealing one." "It's no mistake. You don't see anything else?" John adjusted his eyes. Seemingly random words slowly turned from black to red, then moved to the top of the page. Back is coming, she not. It didn't take John long to rearrange them. She is not coming back. John fought to keep from grabbing the heartless bastard by the throat. Gritting his teeth and staring at the man, he said, "This is no longer funny." "I agree. It isn't. Recognize what you have in front of you. Or are you truly blind?" John's hands couldn't stop shaking. Even after what had happened because of his book, John was unable to believe the man would cross the line and bring Susan into the hoax. "If you recall, you stopped at that page. I didn't direct you to it. Please tell me what it reads." His voice seemed to be truly interested, not a trace of malice. Hazelwood had never been a good bluff, so John started to wonder if maybe he wasn't trying to pull off some sinister prank. "It says she's not coming back." "Do you think it means Susan, or might there be someone else?" "There's only Susan." John remembered that they were talking about their honeymoon plans the morning before she'd vanished. He'd finally given in and told her that they could go to Fiji like she wanted. But it doesn't matter what appears, because either you or one of your friends put this here. "You suppose it's luck that you turned to that exact page?" John motioned toward the book. "It's probably on every page." "Oh, I assure you, it isn't." "So you admit you know what's on the pages?" "What I admit is the Book of Revelation is able to draw the chosen to it. It must be calling to you. Do you feel its pull at the back of your mind?" John wanted to tell the old kook he was out of his head, that he should be locked up in an asylum. But there was a tug, one that made him want to turn the page. He shook his head to clear his thoughts, upset that he had been so gullible as to consider Hazelwood's suggestion. There was no pull, it was just a book.
Why don't you try another? Hazelwood asked. Afraid of what you might find?
This doesn't prove a thing. You are worse than one of those TV psychics. These revelations could apply to anyone.
Turn to another page. I won't take much more of your time.
John flipped through the book and stopped a few pages into chapter 42. Even though he was more than a third of the way through the thick book, the page number in the footer was only 3, and the one next to it was 389. If the next page he turns to was 4, then he at least had to consider the possibility of the book's legitimacy. He could not think of any way Hazelwood might have rigged the pagination.
What page are you on?
Hazelwood asked. Your guess is as good as mine.
What does the number say?
Come on, how'd you do it?
Do you remember what I taught you?
John flashed through the years of information he'd gathered through their chats, many taking place right here in this room. He tried to remember anything concerning the book and pages. Something clicked. There were some who said the book would only give 4 revelations a day, each numbered accordingly. He pushed this realization from his thoughts and examined the red words on the page. This one was too simple. Scared, is, use, to, he, pistol, the. John had completely forgotten about the nickel-plated derringer that Hazelwood had kept on his desk. It was 100 years old and always under glass, but Hazelwood had claimed it still worked.
Anything interesting, John?
John shook his head and continued to stare at the book, trying to collect himself. As he stared at the blood-red words, an internal alarm sounded, his logic and rationality struggling to hold precedence. But it was a losing battle. The book kept calling him, warning him to beware, to stop the crazy old man before it was too late.
John, I need to know. It looks as if you found something of interest.
John picked up his mug and drank as he observed the professor. He hadn't noticed it before, but there was a small bulge under Hazelwood's jacket on the left side of his chest. It was probably just a notepad or a handkerchief, but John supposed it was large enough to be the derringer. In an attempt to distract the old man, John asked Hazelwood if he would mind getting him some more tea. The man answered that he would be glad to. Hazelwood got up from the table with his eerie smile and turned his back to retrieve the teapot. John looked around for the weapon. On the remote chance that Hazelwood was carrying a concealed gun, John needed something. Hazelwood was old and slow. He couldn't forget that the feeble man coming back with the tea had threatened to kill him the last time they met. Hazelwood seemed very definite on that subject. As Hazelwood poured John's tea, making a point not to look at the book, John leaned forward, trying to peek inside his mentor's frayed jacket. He couldn't tell what was inside. Then Hazelwood returned the pot to its cart. The old man's wife had died shortly after the release of John's book. It wouldn't be surprising if the professor had blamed John for her death as well. A devastating loss could change a man and make him do things he wouldn't have considered before. Now that Susan was gone, John knew this to be very true. Before today, he rarely entertained violent thoughts. But inside this study, he was dreaming of strangling the demented son of a bitch sitting across from him.
You're not going to drink it?
I was just letting it cool. John picked up his mug and brought it to his lips, wondering if the tea could be poisoned. Could that be what was causing the violent thoughts, making him consider the book to be real? Actually, I think it needs another moment. He set the mug in front of him. Hazelwood shrugged and drank from his own cup, the same tea that was in John's mug. Or was it?
What do you say to opening up one last page? I promise it'll be the last one.
But it only gives 4 a day, right?
Are you sure we should rush to the end? John's eyes drifted to the cart and the small butter knife. He wondered if he could reach it before the old man drew. 4 per person, yes, Hazelwood said. So maybe we should do yours next. Not necessary. I just need you to verify that it is the book. I take it that you're still not convinced. That it is the book of Revelation? You told me yourself that it only gives revelations to one who has killed another. I've never harmed a soul in my life. Physically, maybe, Hazelwood said, the overwhelming sadness in his voice hanging over the room. Feeling he had the man on the ropes, John said, At least tell me how you did it. Turn to a new page, and I promise to explain everything. John agreed and flipped further into the book. He stopped and stared at the 4 in the footer that should have read 932. Hazelwood stood and said, If the book is not real, then how to explain this? What? John asked, distracted as he studied the letters changing color in front of him. Going, he's, kill, to, you. Will you agree that the book is real if the revelations prove to be true? John looked up from the book in time to see Hazelwood reach for the object inside of his jacket. Before the old man could pull out a gun, John shoved the table into Hazelwood's chest. John, now on his feet, came charging and grabbed the old man. Hazelwood caught his breath, motioned the hand underneath his jacket. What do you think I have in here? Don't move. Well, this isn't going to be very fun. I have something to show you. Don't move, John repeated. You're acting like I'm going to kill someone. Are you? I'm not going to kill anyone. Hazelwood grinned. Not anyone else, he said. Anyone else? What are you talking about? Don't worry, John. I won't hurt you. Shut up and slowly bring your hand out from the jacket. I had to do it, Jonathan, Hazelwood said, without making a move to withdraw his hand. Shut up, John screamed, pulling Hazelwood's hand away before reaching in himself. I wasn't an evil man, I swear it. They say you have to be evil to get it to work. They say the book calls you if you look long enough. Hazelwood tried to reach in his jacket. Stop, John shouted. Leave your hand where it is. But it's the proof you need in order to believe. Go ahead. Take it. John felt something in his hand. Not a gun, but an envelope. It was black. Hazelwood let out a raspy sigh and licked his lips. You'll want to see this. John simply stared at the professor. Then his eyes moved to the envelope. The old man's fingers pushed it on John. Open it. I offer your proof. John tore it open. Thank you, Jonathan. Thank you for coming tonight. For heeding the call. John hesitated, wondered what could be inside the black envelope. Slowly he tipped it to the side and caught the necklace sliding out. He didn't need to see the engraving on the locket to know whose neck it had adorned. Another small object dropped to the floor and bounced off his shoe. Susan's 2-carat engagement ring. John turned on the professor, ready to grab him by the neck and squeeze. In the envelope, Jonathan, look, Hazelwood whispered. He let the necklace fall from his hand and peered inside. There was a folded Polaroid. It had caused the lump under Hazelwood's jacket. Hazelwood struggled to keep his eyes open. Go on, Jonathan. Go ahead and look inside. John pulled out the photo, the envelope fluttering to the ground. I do thank you, Jonathan. Taking her enabled me to find this book, and soon you'll take its burden from me.
Hazelwood took a ragged breath.
Tell me, Jonathan, when did you know where she was? Was it before or after you walked into my house?
That smell. Susan's perfume. He'd been paying too much attention to Hazelwood to realize that it was his fiancée's. The blood-red words. Hazelwood had caused her death. John turned the photo over in his fingers, unable to open it and look at the image inside.
I did what I had to do, Jonathan. Isn't that what you once taught me?
John unfolded the photo. Susan lay on her back, her eyes open. There was a hole a few inches above her right eye. Blood pooled beneath her beautiful blonde hair splayed on the hardwood floor. The same floor he was standing on. Shaking, his mind numb, John reached out and wrapped his finger around his mentor's throat and squeezed. Felt his thumbs denting the larynx, the fleshy tissue stretching under the pressure as Hazelwood's breaths turned wet. John's eyes stayed locked on the old man's face as Hazelwood's fingers clawed at his wrists. He lowered the old man to the floor and continued to squeeze until he felt his fingers tingle. The life finally left his old friend's eyes, and John turned to the book, which had fallen to the floor. Page 166 was now numbered 1. The words changed color before his eyes. Her, goodbye, tell, run. The words made chillingly perfect sense. This truly was the Book of Revelation. John walked out of the room and saw his love's body curled up under a table. He fell to his knees and kissed her cold hand. He said his goodbyes and stifled his sobs. He sat there for hours until his legs fell asleep. Then he lay down next to her and recalled the final word. Run.